June 18, 1944, 0600 hours, a churned field outside Saint-Lô, Normandy. Rain had turned the shell-pocked earth into a theater of mud and metal. The sky, the color of dirty pewter, pressed low over rows of shattered hedgerows. Sergeant Carl Weber, 29, broad-shouldered, a field radio slung at his back like a cumbersome friend, kept his eyes on the horizon and the tight knot of men he still commanded. His uniform was streaked with clotted soil. His boots whispered with every step. At his hip, the Car 98K felt familiar and absurdly small against the enormity of the day's losses. Around him, the dozen soldiers left from his platoon moved with the curious, hollowed calm of men whose hunger had been outpaced by exhaustion. On the other side of the muddy lane, 3 American infantrymen, Corporal James "Jimmy" Mallory, Private First Class Henry Ortiz, and Private Thomas Caldwell, crouched behind the burned husk of a farmhouse. Their M1 Garands clicked soft as a metronome. Jimmy's breath fogged in the cold air. He'd been awake since dusk. He watched the German group approach, noting the surrender flags, a scrap of white cloth tied to the buttstock of one man's rifle, and the way their shoulders sagged like curtains after a storm. He smelled wood smoke, diesel, and the metallic tang of fear. The first words exchanged were terse, functional. 2 languages stitched together by gestures and the universal, tired language of defeat. Lieutenant William S. Hargrove, a lean man with the cramped handwriting of a platoon leader and a sergeant's flat jaw, stepped forward with his pistol holstered and hands raised low, an unspoken promise of order. Names were exchanged, ranks recorded. Carl Weber read his fate in the face of the lieutenant. An ordinary man beneath a uniform, now a number in a process that would stretch from field to sea. The march began as it tends to begin, awkward, with the brittle, forced discipline of captives. Boots sank into furrows. An old mule carcass to the left marked where a shell had taken more than metal. Men muttered. Some prayed. The Americans led them past overturned trucks, burning tires, the bleached bones of what might once have been a military convoy. An M4 Sherman sat idling with a crew already moved forward. Its diesel cough mingled with distant artillery, a rhythm of an advancing front that kept turning the world smaller for those left behind. The field processing was quick and efficient. An American NCO with a crisp voice and a clipboard, Staff Sergeant Douglas Pritchard, barked orders with the comfort of someone who had seen the same scene and found the same methodical solution each time. He rifled through pockets, logged serial numbers, and cataloged the names and wounds. A medic, Private First Class Ruth Benson, her hair tucked under a service cap, moved through the prisoners like a calm tide, checking splints, binding wounds with the meticulousness of someone who had once been a town nurse. The wounded were treated. The rest were given water and thin breakfast rations, canned corned beef, hardtack, and a cup of coffee so black it could frighten a man awake. It was during that first intake that the fissure of disbelief first opened in Carl Weber's mind. He watched the American cooks tending a mobile kitchen, their white aprons flapping like flags, and men passing around thick slices of fresh bread and slabs of tinned meat. It was not the food itself. The German soldiers had learned to make do, but rather the abundance, the orderly distribution, the clean trays, and the way the Americans joked and laughed easily. They had a grammar for comfort that was foreign. A saucepan of stewed vegetables steaming on the side, a clutch of tins marked with neat labels, and the unfamiliar glint of what Weber would later, with a stunned whisper, learn to call steak. Thick, salted, seared meat curling at the edges, steam rising in hazes that smelled of fat and herbs. From whispered conversations in broken English and through interpreters, it slowly emerged. The Americans were not simply receiving rations, they were being fed from a logistics machine the likes of which many German soldiers had never seen. Trains running through secure supply lines, refrigerated cars kept cold by engines humming day and night, farms in the Midwest sending crates and crates of beef, potatoes, and sugar to frontline kitchens. The scale was almost obscene to men who had watched bread shrink in their packs and potatoes be rationed to a single piece. Karl's mouth filled with a sudden sharp taste of longing and disbelief. He turned his head and saw Private Anton Miller, a gaunt 19-year-old with a missing front tooth, press his hands to his stomach as if to steady a storm. The Americans treated their prisoners in a manner that in some ways confounded German expectations. Lieutenant Hargrove insisted on formalities, maps folded, identity cards made, names read aloud and repeated, the ritual of paperwork performed with a clarity that felt like mercy. Even so, compassion and curiosity played side by side. Corporal Mallory, who had once been a butcher in his hometown outside Cleveland, and who had a softness in his eyes that belied the rifle he carried, handed a strip of bread to a trembling German and, with a clumsy smile, tried to translate a joke. The German tried to return the gesture with a remark about the weather, and laughed anyway, the sound brittle but human. By midday, the prisoners were loaded onto trucks. The route would take them through English Channel ports and eventually, for many, across an ocean. They would be counted, fed, and catalogued into camps with names like Camp Hereford and Camp Shelby, places that would become, for the duration of captivity, the world. As the convoy rumbled away from the field, the smell of frying meat hung in the air like an accusation and an invitation. It followed them like a ghost. Karl Weber sat on the tailgate of a truck, his hands folded, the Car 98K left behind with other surrendered arms, and watched the Americans prepare another batch of food. He tried to reconcile the image of the enemy's calm abundance with the ragged memory of his own platoon, hungry and cold and driven back. For the first time since the war began to turn against them, he felt a dislocation that went beyond defeat. A creeping awareness that the difference between armies was not only in steel and bullets, but in the capacity to feed, to care, and to marshal resources that turned plenty into a weapon as effective as any tank. As the convoy climbed a ridge and the Norman countryside slid past in gray sheets, Karl pressed his forehead to his knees and listened to the distant thump of an artillery piece, the slap of water against canvas, the murmur of men. He couldn't yet know how the sight of steak and well-stocked kitchens would echo through months on American soil, how it would seed stories in barracks and letters home, and how it would become a symbol, painful, confusing, and oddly intimate, of a nation's power. July 3, 1944, 04:30 hours. Aboard the Liberty ship SS John W. Brown, mid-Atlantic. The sea was a slow heave of gray-green water beneath a sky painted in diluted cobalt. Salt crusted on every surface, on the ropes, the railings, and the men's lips. The SS John W. Brown was one of hundreds, utilitarian, steel-bellied, and tireless, ferrying the captured and the conquerors across the ocean. On the upper deck, a line of German prisoners stood shoulder to shoulder under the watchful gaze of two American guards armed with Thompson submachine guns. The wind cut sharp through their thin uniforms, but the smell, coffee, bacon, and something sweet baking below, curled through the air like a taunt. Sergeant Karl Weber gripped the railing, his knuckles pale. He watched seagulls trace wide, lazy circles in the dawn light, their cries piercing the ocean hush. Next to him, young Anton Müller breathed through chattering teeth and said softly, "Riecht nach zu Hause," like breakfast at home. Karl almost laughed. It was true. The smell of frying fat and bread was hauntingly domestic. But it was not home. It was the enemy's home carried to sea. Inside the ship's galley, U.S. Navy cooks moved with the rhythm of routine. Massive pans hissed with butter and salt, eggs cracked in endless succession, piles of bacon sizzled beside loaves of soft white bread. Even among the Americans, the quantity was impressive. Food enough for hundreds, served hot and steady. Logistics was the silent arm of the U.S. war machine, and here, miles from land, its strength was displayed not in weapons, but in plates. When the prisoners were finally given breakfast, the difference was clear. A tin of oatmeal, a slice of bread, and coffee, bitter but real, were handed out with efficiency. It wasn't luxury, but it wasn't hunger either. For the Germans who had known days of cold broth and moldy crusts, even this was almost surreal. Karl watched as a few men hesitated, unsure whether to eat. He did not. He tore into the bread with a hunger both physical and moral, tasting surrender in every bite. 2 days later, land emerged from the mist like a mirage, the docks of New York Harbor. For many of the prisoners it was their first glimpse of America, a skyline of impossible verticals, cranes swinging, sirens blaring, and everywhere the scent of roasting coffee and diesel fuel. On the horizon, the Statue of Liberty stood pale in the morning fog. Some prisoners whispered to each other, not about politics, not about Hitler, but about the scale. "Look," Anton murmured, "they built all this while fighting a war?" As the ship docked, soldiers from the U.S. Army Transportation Corps guided the prisoners down the gangway. An MP with a clipboard read off their names. Trucks waited to ferry them inland. Each prisoner was tagged with an identification number, a small cardboard square strung around the neck. Karl's read POW 421-17A. The journey inland was a procession through an alien abundance. Through the truck's slotted sides, Karl saw fields of corn stretching to the horizon, barns painted bright red, and towns with grocery stores advertising fresh meat daily. Every sight was a reminder of what the Reich had failed to sustain, the sheer material might that powered America's war. Even the train stations, when they arrived at one near Maryland, were stacked with crates marked U.S. Army rations and coffee, instant. By dusk, they reached Camp Hereford, one of the largest POW camps in the United States. Barbed wire gleamed in the fading light, but inside the fences stood wooden barracks, neat and orderly. A flag flapped above the entrance, the smell of supper drifted through the evening air. "Line up, prisoners," an MP barked. "Welcome to your new quarters." As the gates closed behind them, Karl expected the hunger to return, the thin soups, the ration lines, the hollow ache. Instead, as he entered the mess hall, he stopped dead. On the long wooden tables, under harsh electric light, sat metal trays piled with food: mashed potatoes, boiled vegetables, slices of bread thick as a hand, and, impossibly, slabs of grilled beef. Anton gasped. Another prisoner whispered, "They're feeding us like their own." An American sergeant overseeing the meal laughed when he saw their expressions. "Don't look so surprised, boys. Geneva Convention says you eat what we eat." He clapped one of the men on the shoulder and pointed to the steaming trays. "Now get it while it's hot." The room filled with an uneasy silence as the Germans took their seats. Karl picked up his fork slowly, staring at the steak before him. It wasn't the thin, gristly kind they'd seen at the front. This was marbled, juicy, and seasoned. When he cut into it, the smell rose up rich and savory. For a moment, he forgot the barbed wire, the uniforms, even the war itself. The absurdity of it all struck him. Across the ocean, men were dying for inches of ground, while here the enemy fed him like a guest. He chewed slowly, as if it might vanish. Around him, conversation began in low murmurs, belief mixed with a strange gratitude. "This is what they eat every day?" Anton asked, his voice hushed. Karl swallowed and looked toward the American cooks who were already preparing another tray. Every day. And they don't even call it luxury. That night, as lights dimmed across the camp, the prisoners lay awake listening to the hum of generators, the faint strains of swing music from a distant radio, and the clink of dishes being washed. For the first time since his capture, Karl felt not just defeated, but bewildered. This was not the war he had been told to expect. He rolled onto his side and whispered into the dark. If they eat like this in captivity, what must freedom taste like? August 1944, Camp Hereford, Texas. The wind swept over the flat plains, carrying the dry heat of the American South. Rows of wooden barracks stood like silent soldiers behind barbed wire, their tin roofs shimmering under the brutal sun. The German prisoners had been here for almost a month now, and the shock of their first meals had not faded. If anything, it had deepened into a kind of quiet reverence. Sergeant Karl Weber rose early every morning. He'd step outside before roll call, his boots crunching on gravel, and watch the American flag rise over the camp's guard tower. He still felt the sting of defeat, but he also couldn't help noticing the rhythm of life here, predictable, structured, and above all, fed. Breakfast was served at 0600 sharp. Trays of scrambled eggs, buttered toast, and sometimes pancakes with syrup were set out for the prisoners. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it was endless, refilled by American cooks who joked with the guards while moving between rows of seated men. Karl would glance around the mess hall, watching his fellow soldiers eat in disbelief. They'd whisper to one another, half in jest, half in awe. "Even our officers never ate like this. Is this war or paradise? Maybe we lost to the right people." The abundance gnawed at them, not from hunger anymore, but from the uneasy realization of what it meant. America wasn't winning the war through sheer luck or numbers. It was winning through a kind of invisible strength that stretched from farms to factories, kitchens to front lines. After breakfast, the prisoners were assigned work details. Some repaired fences or sorted supplies in warehouses. Others tended the camp's vegetable gardens, which grew under the relentless Texas sun. Karl volunteered for kitchen duty, partly because it gave him purpose, partly because he wanted to understand the miracle he saw every day. In the camp kitchen, he found an efficiency that rivaled any German barracks. Everything had its place. There were mountains of potatoes in burlap sacks, barrels of flour, and boxes of canned fruit stacked to the ceiling. Refrigerated trucks came in every few days, unloading beef and chicken packed in ice. Karl stood beside the head cook, Sergeant Mike Donnelly, a burly man from Chicago, who treated the kitchen like a temple. "You boys sure like the steak, huh?" Donnelly grinned as he flipped a sizzling cut on the griddle. Karl hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, Sergeant. In Germany, only officers, or the rich, maybe once a year." Donnelly laughed. "Here it's Tuesday." He slid the meat onto a tray and handed Karl a spatula. "Help me with these onions, and don't burn 'em. The colonel likes 'em golden, not black." That moment, that casual generosity, left Karl silent. As he chopped onions beside the American, he thought about his home in Bavaria, the shortages, the ration cards, his mother trading family heirlooms for bread. The difference between nations was not only in ideals or armies, but in what they could feed their sons. By noon, the camp would hum with activity. Some prisoners built furniture for nearby farms, others painted murals or played in the camp orchestra. In one corner of the compound, a group of former art students created chalk portraits of the guards for cigarettes. The Americans didn't just tolerate it, they encouraged it. They treated their captives not as enemies to be broken, but as men who needed something to occupy the time. Lunch that day was stew, thick with beef, carrots, and potatoes. Bread came warm from the camp bakery, its crust golden. When the trays were passed around, Anton Mueller looked up at Karl and said quietly, "If my father saw this, he wouldn't believe it. We were told Americans were savages." Karl smiled faintly. "Then maybe savages know how to cook." Laughter rippled around the table, the kind that carried both relief and confusion. They were prisoners, yes, but fed better than they had been as soldiers. That evening, when the sun fell red across the camp, the prisoners gathered near the wire fence, staring out towards the empty horizon. Beyond it lay the farms that fed them, endless fields of grain and cattle ranches that seemed to stretch forever. The guards relaxed in their chairs, passing a radio between them. Benny Goodman's Sing, Sing, Sing floated on the warm wind, a strange soundtrack to captivity. Inside his barrack, Karl wrote a letter to his wife. The pencil trembled in his hand as he searched for the right words. "My dearest Elise, you will not believe me when I tell you that I am eating meat again. Real meat. Every day. The Americans have so much food, they treat even prisoners like guests. It is not humiliation I feel, but confusion. They fight with kindness as much as with bullets. I cannot explain it, only that I think now we did not understand our enemy at all." He folded the letter, sealed it, and set it aside for the Red Cross courier. Outside, night settled soft and slow over Camp Hereford. For many of the prisoners, captivity had become an education, not just in survival, but in the quiet power of plenty. Carl lay back on his cot, listening to the faint laughter from the guard post and the rhythmic hum of the kitchen generator still running late into the night. The smell of cooked beef hung faintly in the air. For the first time in years, his stomach was full, and his beliefs uncertain. October 1944. Camp Hereford, Texas. Autumn came gently to the plains. The Texas heat softened into cool evenings, and the endless blue sky stretched wide above the golden fields. For the German prisoners, life had fallen into a strange, steady rhythm, one that felt almost peaceful. The daily meals, the work, the music from the guards' radios, all of it blurred into a routine that made them forget, if only briefly, that they were captives of war. Each morning, Carl Weber joined the work detail assigned to a nearby farm. A convoy of trucks carried them out beyond the camp fences, escorted by 2 MPs who rarely even touched their rifles. The farm belonged to an old Texan named Robert Bob Harris, a man with a sunburned face and an easy drawl. He greeted the Germans every day as if they were hired hands, not prisoners. "Mornin', boys," he'd shout, waving from his porch. "Coffee's in the pot, and the cows don't milk themselves." They'd laugh, even Carl, who once thought laughter impossible after capture. Out there, surrounded by open land and the smell of tilled soil, it was hard to feel like a prisoner. They harvested corn, mended fences, and fixed tractors. The Americans paid them a few cents a day in camp coupons, which could be used at the commissary to buy small luxuries: chocolate, tobacco, soap, even postcards. At lunch, they'd sit beneath a tree, eating sandwiches thick with roast beef and cheese. Sometimes Harris's wife, Mary, would bring them lemonade and cookies. The kindness disarmed them more than any weapon ever could. "Why?" Anton asked one afternoon, wiping crumbs from his chin. "Why do they treat us like this?" Carl shrugged, watching the wind roll through the cornfields. "Maybe because they can afford to." He paused, then added quietly, "Or maybe because they want us to see what we were fighting against." That evening, when they returned to the camp, Carl walked past the kitchens again. Through the open door, he saw Sergeant Donnelly and his crew preparing dinner: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, gravy, green beans. It was another feast, ordinary by American standards, but extraordinary to those who'd lived on rations of black bread and turnip soup. Inside the mess hall, the air was thick with warmth and laughter. One prisoner strummed a guitar, another sketched caricatures of the guards, who pretended to look stern while secretly enjoying the attention. On one wall, someone had painted a mural, a sprawling landscape of Germany with hills and rivers and tidy farms. Below it, in careful handwriting, someone had written, "Freedom is not just outside the fence. It begins in the stomach." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The prisoners had grown stronger, healthier, even happier in captivity than they had been as soldiers. It was a quiet humiliation wrapped in comfort. That night, Carl lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling. In his hands, he held a folded clipping from a camp newsletter, an article written by an American journalist visiting the site. It praised the humane treatment of prisoners, noting how well fed and well kept they were. America wins wars not just with weapons, but with decency, the journalist wrote. Karl couldn't stop thinking about that line. Decency. The word had a weight he didn't know how to measure. He thought of the war back home, of cities in ruins, of families scraping for bread, and of the letters Elise had written about ration lines and fear. And here he was, eating steak in the land of the enemy. It was almost unbearable. Weeks turned into months. Winter crept in, but the camp remained warm. Blankets were issued, the food stayed abundant, and the guards even decorated the mess hall for Christmas. They set up a tree, complete with tinsel and lights. The prisoners sang carols, German and English, their voices blending softly in the cold night. Donnelly served roast turkey and pumpkin pie. For many Germans, it was their first taste of the dessert. Sweet, spiced, strange, and wonderful. Anton took a bite and grinned. "It tastes like nothing we have," he said. Karl smiled faintly. "It tastes like they've never known hunger." Later, after lights out, Karl wrote in his diary by flashlight. "Today I realized something. They have no ruins here, no bombed-out houses, no hunger, no cold. Their war is fought an ocean away. And maybe that is their strength. They have protected their home, and because of that, they can afford to be kind. But this kindness, it cuts deeper than cruelty ever could." As the months went on, letters from home arrived sporadically. Some brought news of cities destroyed, others of families displaced. The contrast between the world inside the camp and the devastation outside grew unbearable. But somehow, within that contradiction, something in the prisoners began to shift. They started to talk less about Hitler and more about rebuilding, less about victory, more about survival. The propaganda had faded, the illusion of superiority was gone. In its place was something new: respect, curiosity, maybe even hope. By spring of 1945, the war in Europe was ending. Rumors of Germany's collapse spread through the camp like wildfire. Some wept quietly, others sat in silence. When the official announcement finally came that the Third Reich had surrendered, there was no cheer, no defiance. Just a long, stunned silence, broken only by the distant hum of an American generator and the smell of coffee brewing, steady as ever. Karl looked around the mess hall that morning. The same food was served, the same order maintained, but now everything felt different. He raised his cup of coffee and murmured to Anton, "We lost the war long before the guns stopped. We just didn't see it." Anton nodded, eyes fixed on his tray. "We lost it in the kitchens." Outside, the flag flapped gently in the warm breeze, the symbol of a nation that had conquered through plenty, through discipline, through compassion. And as the men filed out, Karl Weber thought not of defeat anymore, but of what might come next, of a Germany that could one day feed its people the way America did its prisoners. He didn't know it yet, but he would carry that dream home across the ocean, a quiet seed of change, born from a slice of steak and the mercy of his captors.